There are moments in history that don't need drums or grand ceremonies. They begin with a strange silence. A quiet shift that makes the world suddenly turn its head. Burkina Faso stepped into such a moment when it declared something no one in this century had ever dared to say aloud. A small nation in the Sahel, where people had long bowed before papers signed in offices half a world away, suddenly stood up and claimed control over the land that had fed their ancestors for thousands of years. A decision that looked simple on the surface, yet carried the weight of an entire generation, sending shockwaves far beyond any border. For more than a century, the people of Burkina lived inside a paradox they could barely name. They planted, tended, harvested, they worked under the red dust of the Sahel, growing maize, millet, and peanuts that kept the nation alive. But everything they produced, every inch of their labor, was owned on paper by people who had never stepped foot on those fields. Burkina's land was never truly Burkina's. Distant offices in Europe and the United States held the real authority, while the people themselves were allowed to exist only on the edges of their own lives. Not through open violence, not through blatant conquest, but through documents, contracts, and quiet maps that carried immense power. Picture a mother standing on the land passed down from her grandmother. She watches metal stakes hammered into the soil, as if someone had decided the boundaries of her life without ever asking her. Imagine a young father waking early each rainy season, only to watch foreign company trucks drive through his village carrying clay, gold ore, manganese, resources born of this land, yet shipped to ports whose names he has never heard. This is a loss that creates no sound, but slowly erodes a person's dignity. And then, in the midst of everything the world assumed was unshakable, Burkina Faso made a declaration so simple it felt almost impossible. Starting today, all land in the country would be placed under the guardianship of the state. No more concessions lasting decades. No more corporations holding land forever. No more territories changing hands with a soulless signature. Land would be allocated based on need, national priorities, and the rights of the people who actually live on it. The world trembled not because the decision was too bold, but because it asked a question many are afraid to confront. What happens when a nation takes back the very foundation of its existence? What happens when Africa steps into the role of owner instead of the owned? And even more important, what shifts in the global balance of power when a people stand and declare that their land is no longer anyone's commodity? Burkina Faso didn't just change a policy. It rewrote the logic of an entire century. The moment the old land maps were erased, the world had to face the truth. A small but unyielding nation could dismantle a model that had survived generations. And from that point on, the story was no longer only Burkina's story. It became a message to all of Africa. When you reclaim your land, you reclaim your voice. When you reclaim your voice, you reclaim your future. If you care about the journey of a continent rewriting its own destiny, stay with us until the very end of this story. And don't forget to leave a comment and subscribe, so you can join us in uncovering the true voice of this continent. Before Burkina Faso dared to make a decision that shook the global order, the country had lived through a pain that stretched across decades. A pain without sound, without war, without mourning flags, yet constant and burning. Like the Sahel sun, wearing people down slowly but surely. To understand why land reform became a historic turning point, we must return to a time when every plot of land, every curve on the national map, carried a deep wound in the hearts of its people. For generations, land in Burkina stopped being understood as the place where a family puts down roots. It became a resource to be traded, carved up, and sold between distant powers thousands of kilometers away from village life. More than 400,000 hectares of land had been leased, ceded, or transferred to foreign interest groups in just 2 decades. That number isn't just a statistic. It is the shrinking of childhood dreams, the interruption of harvest seasons, the displacement of families pushed from fertile soil to the dry edge of the forests. Fields that once fed entire communities were fenced off with metal barriers. Outside were the golden millet fields of local farmers. Inside were the machines of mining corporations. Places that once welcomed the rainy season like a festival of the earth were now nothing more than dusty roads for container trucks loaded with ore. One mother said she had seen boundary stakes hammered into the ground beside her family garden 3 different times. And 3 times she stood there unable to fully understand what the papers said. That helplessness did not come from poverty. It came from the feeling that her land no longer belonged to her. But the loss did not appear only on maps. It seeped into everyday life in every village. Young people left home not because they wanted to, but because the fields they worked had fallen inside a giant red zone on the mineral map. Fathers no longer dared to fix the edge of their fields or dig a new pond, afraid that any value they created would become another reason for someone else to take it away. And mothers, those who carry the deepest memory of the land, often asked themselves at the start of each planting season whether they would still be allowed to sow the next one. The state itself was trapped inside this fragmentation. Every time it wanted to build a road, officials had to negotiate with dozens of landowners, some of whom did not even live in the country. When they wanted to expand a clinic or a school, the government had to calculate compensation for people whom local residents had never met. A nation cannot build its future if every step depends on the permission of invisible hands holding its resources. But nothing was as painful as the silence of the young. They grew up beside dry fields yet watched trucks of gold and manganese pass their door every day. In some provinces, mining sites expanded so aggressively that they swallowed up 40% of farmland. These young people were not angry. They simply saw one bitter truth. Their future was being carried away on the backs of trucks heading toward faraway ports. This erosion did not come from violence. It came from a system designed with precision. A system that helped those with power keep their power, helped those with documents keep the land, and pushed the people into a position where they could only farm on soil that might be taken from them at any moment. The longer this system existed, the deeper fear took root. Fear of losing land, fear of losing a livelihood, fear of the sound of a truck stopping at the village gate. But precisely because this pain had been suppressed for so long, Burkina Faso's decision exploded with such force. A people only truly rise when they have reached the limits of their endurance. If this story is opening a new way for you to see land, dignity, and the right to own your destiny, stay with us for the next part. And don't forget to leave a comment and subscribe, so you can walk with us on this journey through an Africa awakening day by day. There are decisions in history that don't need loud propaganda campaigns or streets filled with waving flags. They need only a single sentence, a single signature, a single moment when the will of an entire nation is compressed into one decisive stroke of a pen. For Burkina Faso, that moment came when the government declared that all land in the country would be placed under the guardianship of the state. No more permanent ownership, no more decades-long contracts for foreign corporations, no more fertile lands belonging to people who had never once seen a Sahel rainy season. That announcement didn't just shake the fields preparing for planting season. It sent an unfamiliar breeze through every village long accustomed to the silence of fate. From the father repairing his plow to the mother drying millet seeds on her porch. Everyone heard the news in their own way, but they all shared the same feeling, a mix of shock and relief. And a quiet question rising inside them. At last, has the thing no one dared to hope for finally begun? On international media, the reaction came instantly. Western analysts called the decision risky, unpredictable, a threat to investment flows. But in the rural heart of Burkina, people didn't call it risky. They called it something that should have happened long ago. Because they understood something distant research institutes cannot. No one can build a future on land that isn't truly theirs. That difference in perspective reveals a larger truth. To the West, land is an asset, a market, a resource listed on corporate balance sheets. To Burkina's farmers, land is life, family memory, the place where ancestors are buried. If one side sees land as a product to be bought and sold, the other sees land as part of themselves. And when that value is suppressed for too long, an eruption becomes inevitable. Burkina Faso's decision was like a lightning strike hitting a model that had stood firm for a century. It created an uneasy silence in international political meetings. forcing experts to ask questions they once thought would never need to be asked. Can a small nation really change the rules written by global powers? And if it can, will others follow? But the most important shift didn't happen in conference rooms in Brussels or Washington. It happened far from the cameras. On the red earth outside small towns. Young men looked over their fields without the old fear that they could be taken away overnight. Women began talking about expanding their shea gardens instead of worrying about strange metal stakes. Elderly men, who had stayed silent for years, now sat straighter when speaking about the future. This was the moment the country pivoted. Not a geopolitical pivot, but a spiritual one. For the first time in generations, a people felt they were standing on land that was truly theirs. Not in fear, not in hopeless waiting. The government's decision was only the spark. The real fire was lit inside the hearts of ordinary people. And that moment raises the most important question of all. When a nation understands it has the right to own its destiny, what will it become? And how will the world respond to an Africa that refuses to stay in its old place? When the decision on land guardianship was announced, it didn't just appear in newspapers or in quiet political meetings. It spread into every household through the quiet stories of people who seemed to have nothing to do with national-scale reforms. Yet it was they, people with sunburned faces and soil on their hands, who felt the true weight of this change most deeply. In a village in the southern grasslands, a farmer named Yakuba heard the news while repairing the plow blade he had used for more than a dozen seasons. He stayed silent for a long time, not because he didn't understand the meaning of the decision, but because it felt like a promise he had never dared to believe would come true. All his life, land had been something that could be taken from him with a single official document he couldn't even read. He lived, worked, and hoped on ground that had never been certain. This time, for the first time in decades, he felt the land was not only beneath his feet, but finally in his hands. A few districts away, Fatimata, a woman who had led a shea-growing group for many years, stood before the small garden passed down by her ancestors. In past harvest seasons, she always looked at the metal fences rising in the distance and feared the day they might reach her doorstep. When the new decision was announced, she said her first feeling wasn't joy, it was relief. Relief because she knew that wall of steel would finally stop. And from that relief, another thought began to grow. If my land is safe, what can I build with it? Not to defend, but to develop. Far to the north, where land had long been carved apart by mining zones, a group of young men gathered that same afternoon. They sat on a barren patch of earth that once belonged to a foreign company. One of them said that for the first time in his life, he was thinking about forming a cooperative instead of leaving for the city. The words sounded simple, yet carried the weight of an entire generation. When the land is no longer in someone else's hands, the future no longer has to be found somewhere far away. Of course, not everyone welcomed the reform with pure excitement. Those who had benefited from the old system were hesitant. Some village chiefs worried whether the state would truly keep its promise of fair distribution. A few small landholders feared that the power they had long enjoyed would evaporate. And many families, after years of dispossession, held on to a cautious, instinctive distrust. Pain does not disappear just because a policy changes. Yet amid these mixed emotions, one thing was undeniable. This reform touched the hearts of the people more deeply than any previous initiative. It didn't speak in percentages. It didn't hide behind economic jargon. It didn't march under political slogans. It began with the simplest question: who does the land belong to? And it answered in a way the people had not heard in a century. Land belongs to those who live on it, work on it, and raise their children on it. The awakening across the country, therefore, was not a burst of noise, it was an echo. It began with the government's announcement, but it spread through the hearts of ordinary people. Farmers saw a future. Women saw opportunity.
Focus to West
Young
Africa,
people saw
where
a
Russia
reason
continues
to stay,
to deepen
and the
its
elders
ties
saw that they were
and
still able to witness something finally being set right. While the people of Burkina Faso welcomed the land reform with honest, everyday emotions, the reaction from the outside world was entirely different. It wasn't relief or hope, it was a shock that spread from Washington to Brussels to Paris. What unsettled the world wasn't the decision itself, but the fact that a small nation in the Sahel had done something no one had dared to imagine for decades, and a land control model built on the economic dominance of global powers. Western think tanks immediately launched emergency meetings. Dense analytical reports appeared within days, full of cold but anxious language. They called the reform a dangerous restructuring. They warned that a state guardianship model could spread to Ghana, Mali, Niger, Senegal, Nigeria. To them, the danger wasn't Burkina Faso. The danger was the precedent Burkina might create, a precedent that could shake Western economic leverage across the African continent. In European meeting rooms, many experts admitted something they had never said publicly. Western power in Africa didn't just come from aid, military presence, or diplomacy. It came from land control. The vast areas granted to mining, agricultural, and energy corporations for decades allowed them to command flows of raw materials, food, and minerals. When Burkina Faso decided to place all land under state guardianship, that model suddenly lost its foundation. It wasn't only Western governments that reacted. Multinational corporations felt the hit sharply. A European company with a 30-year mining project was suddenly asked to renegotiate. A U.S. agribusiness preparing to expand 50,000 hectares received notice that its paperwork was suspended under new regulations. Investors who once relied confidently on financial power now saw that the map they depended on was no longer fixed. What frightened them most wasn't Burkina Faso, but the possibility that other nations might follow. Meanwhile, many African countries viewed the moment with a completely different lens. In Accra, Ghanaian experts debated whether they could adopt a similar model to protect coastal areas from foreign tourism projects. In Niger and Mali, youth movements celebrated Burkina Faso as a new symbol of sovereignty. In Nigeria, some economists began sketching scenarios. If 5 West African nations adopted the guardianship model together, the region could control up to 70% of its strategic agricultural corridor by 2040. These reactions revealed something clear. Burkina Faso's decision was not just an internal reform. It had become a mirror, a challenge, and a suggestion that Africa could rewrite its role in the global value chain. Yet beneath the conference room analyses lay a quiet fear few dared to voice. If a small country like Burkina Faso could break a power structure that had existed for centuries, what happens when larger nations do the same? Global power is built on the flow of resources, and when that flow shifts direction, the entire order shifts with it. That is why Burkina's land reform didn't just startle the world. It forced the world to confront a fundamental question generations have avoided. When Africa stands tall on its own land, where will the world order go next? In the first weeks after Burkina Faso announced its land reform, international media stayed busy predicting economic impacts, investment risks, and the reactions of global powers. But there was something many observers underestimated. The decision didn't just redraw the map of power. It opened a new conversation across Africa, one that for years had existed only behind closed doors or in the hearts of young people searching for a future that truly belonged to them. In Ghana, researchers closely examined every detail of Burkina's land guardianship model. They saw in it an answer to decades-old problems in coastal regions, where land had been bought up by foreign tourism projects while local communities lost access to their natural resources. Internal discussions quickly began. Could Ghana adopt a similar version to protect its coastline? The question no longer belonged only to academics. It spread to civil society organizations, environmental groups, and traditional fishing communities. In Senegal, youth movements expressed strong solidarity. They had watched too many areas transformed into resorts or commercial zones serving outside interests. When Burkina Faso dared to end that pattern, many young Senegalese saw it as a sign that their generation did not have to endure the same old systems forever. They began asking questions about traditional land rights, the role of local communities, and the state's responsibility in protecting national heritage. Mali and Niger, Burkina's partners in the Sahel, reacted even more forcefully. Both countries had faced enormous pressure from the uncontrolled expansion of mining zones and cross-border extraction projects. When Burkina Faso proactively redrew its land use map to protect local communities, leaders and social groups in Mali and Niger immediately organized joint consultations. They discussed adopting a guardianship model to protect grazing lands, prevent conflicts between farmers and nomadic herders, and reduce dependence on foreign mining corporations. In Nigeria, the most populous nation in Africa, the response was more systemic. Several economic experts published analyses suggesting that if 5 West African countries adopted similar models, the region could control most of its strategic agricultural corridor by 2040. That would affect not only food security but also reshape how the continent manages its dependency on imports from Europe and Asia. Research institutes in Abuja quickly produced scenarios describing a West Africa capable of restructuring its food and mineral supply chains in a more self-reliant direction. This ripple effect didn't come from Burkina Faso's economic or military power, but from the power of an example. When a small but determined nation breaks an old model, it forces neighboring countries to ask whether they themselves are living under rules that no longer fit the times. It reminds them that sometimes what transforms an entire continent is not the strength of a giant, but the resolve of a nation once written off. Most importantly, these conversations are shaking a belief the world has treated as obvious for decades, that Africa must accept the role of raw material supplier. That African land is an open resource for any corporation with enough money. When Burkina Faso challenged that idea, they weren't just saying we want sovereignty. They were saying Africa can be sovereign. And now the question is no longer how far Burkina will go, but how the continent will follow. When Burkina Faso's new land map was released, the world saw it as a political document. But at home, the people saw it as a promise finally written into reality. And that promise did not wait. It began turning into concrete change within the very first weeks after the reform. Those changes were not dramatic or loud, but they shook people's lives in ways no aid program or international project had ever managed to do. In the heart of the agricultural regions, the Ministry of Agriculture opened registration points for land use rights. Long lines formed under the Sahel sun, but people weren't lining up to ask for money, for relief, or for favors. They came to affirm their right to stand on their own land. In just 6 months, more than 300,000 hectares were reassigned to farming families, cooperatives, and youth groups. That number wasn't a political gesture. It was real land, real fields, places people could touch, cultivate, and finally call our farm. In the eastern region, where land had long been fractured by old disputes, farmers began expanding their wet rice systems. They built new canals, dug new reservoirs, no longer afraid that investing in their land would make it more attractive for someone else to seize. In just one season, the area of rice paddies grew by nearly 300 hectares. But the most remarkable change wasn't the expansion, it was the mindset. Farmers were no longer planting just to survive the year. They were planting for the years ahead. In Bolgu and Muhun, areas once heavily affected by mining, families were given back the riverbank plots that had been restricted for years. As water flowed again through the irrigation zones, yields of millet and sorghum rose sharply. An elder said during a community meeting that the difference wasn't in the harvest, but in confidence. For the first time in many years, people felt that what they planted today would not be taken away tomorrow. These changes weren't only for men. Women, who carry most of the agricultural labor in the Sahel, became some of the biggest beneficiaries. In the past, they worked small, fragile plots and lived each season fearing they might lose access. But when the reform opened land zones dedicated to women's groups, thousands suddenly gained space to build stable shea, sesame, and vegetable farms. In one southern district, a women's collective doubled its shea production in just one season because they were finally cultivating land that had been abandoned within the boundary of an old mine. One member said that for the first time in her life, she felt she wasn't just working for food, but for the growth of the entire community. Young people also stepped into a new chapter. Once, they saw their villages as places with no future. Now, with land set aside for youth projects, they began forming agricultural cooperatives, building drip irrigation vegetable farms, even opening small processing workshops. A youth group in the north used 10 hectares they were granted to create a millet processing plant and sell to regional markets, reducing local dependence on imports. They weren't just creating products, they were creating reasons to stay. All these quiet transformations add up to one simple truth. When people own their future, they will write it themselves. No slogans needed. No explanations. Just land. The transformation of the land didn't only affect fields, harvests, or livelihoods, it touched something deeper, something most people hesitate to confront: politics, because land is not only a physical foundation, it is the foundation of power. And when Burkina Faso chose to place all land under state guardianship, it forced the entire political system to change with it. Every level of government, from the ministries to the smallest village office, had to confront a question they had avoided for decades: who has the right to decide the future of this land? In many regions, the new land allocation councils became the center of political life. Before the reform, local officials had to deal with endless disputes between villagers and companies, between families and interest groups. These disputes were often long, complicated, and at times explosive. After the reform, their role shifted. They were no longer just the people who cleaned up the aftermath, they became the people shaping the future. Their decisions didn't just end conflicts, they opened opportunities or closed paths for entire communities. That was both an honor and a burden. And that burden created pressures like never before. Many local officials, used to the old model, felt disoriented by this new level of oversight. People were no longer watching from the outside. They demanded transparency, public allocation lists, clear criteria, and guarantees that power would not be abused. In one western district, when a land allocation was suspected of being unfair, the entire village walked to the commune office and demanded dialogue. No shouting, no destruction, but the weight of their expectation forced the administration to confront itself. New voices began to emerge. Some believed a strong state was necessary to protect land from outside forces. They argued that only a centralized system could resist multinational corporations that had long manipulated legal and financial loopholes. But others feared that concentrated power could create new abuses. They reminded everyone of a simple truth that never expires: power, whether good or bad, must be monitored. In village meetings, elders spoke about the responsibility of the current generation. They recalled older times when land wasn't priced, when every family understood its boundaries and its rights. Those times, they said, could never fully return, but their spirit could be recreated in a way that fits the present. One elder said something that stayed with everyone: the most frightening thing is not that the state has power, but that the people might forget they have the power to watch the state. Meanwhile, in the capital, Ouagadougou, debates circled around a question that sounded simple but had no easy answer: who should receive land first? Farmers, women, young people, nomadic herders, migrants returning home. Each group had legitimate reasons. Each had a history of being overlooked. And because of that, the government faced a challenge with no precedent. How do you ensure fairness without creating division? How do you make reform a collective step forward, not a competition among people who are supposed to be on the same side? In closed-door meetings, many officials admitted that the land reform had changed the way they saw their own responsibilities. Before, they could point to legal limits, old contracts, or pressure from external actors. Now they faced a new reality. The people knew the land belonged to them. They knew the power held by the state existed to serve them. And they would not tolerate any form of concealment. The land reform transformed Burkina Faso's politics into a new kind of stage. Not a stage for speeches, but for action. Not a place where leaders talk about the future, but a place where they must prove that the future truly belongs to the people. As the first changes began to take root inside Burkina Faso, the outside reaction became only the surface of a much deeper shift forming within the structure of global power. Many saw the land reform as a domestic policy, but strategists recognized something beneath it: a signal shaking the very foundations that had sustained great power influence for centuries. Not because Burkina Faso was too powerful, but because it dared to do what many other nations had quietly considered yet never dared to attempt. When a small link breaks free from a chain, the entire chain must tighten, or break. In closed offices in Washington, internal memos circulated rapidly. Experts warned that the land guardianship model could trigger the reassessment of mining, agricultural, and energy agreements signed with African nations over the past 50 years. One line from a confidential report spread quietly: if West African countries adopt this model collectively, our influence in the region will decline significantly within 5 years. That was not a moment of panic. It was long-term worry written in the language of strategy. In Brussels, a senior official acknowledged that Europe's supply chain stability depends heavily on access to African land. Large-scale agricultural projects, cheap commodity fields, and strategic mining zones all rely on African governments accepting the old model. One Burkina Faso stepping outside that model is an inconvenience. An Africa following Burkina Faso is a threat. And that is precisely what is beginning to appear. Paris did not stay silent either. In internal meetings, advisors questioned what a new West Africa would mean. One where countries decide their own land use priorities instead of honoring outdated arrangements. For France, a nation with a long history in West Africa, this was not only an economic or diplomatic issue. It was a symbolic shift, one that signals the end of a model once treated as unquestionable. Meanwhile, many international corporations, long accustomed to negotiating directly with African governments, now faced the risk of having their agreements re-examined from the ground up. A U.S. energy company had to halt a biofuel project because the land it planned to use fell within a zone being reassessed under the new law. A European mining corporation began preparing to reduce staff as its operational area shrank. Quiet murmurs within the business world quickly turned into pressure sent to diplomatic missions. They demanded their governments intervene to maintain stability. But stability, in their vocabulary, meant preserving the old order. Yet on the other side of the equation, Africa no longer responded the old way. Many nations saw Burkina Faso's willingness to break the traditional structure as an opportunity to rewrite their own roles. No longer just mineral suppliers. No longer mere producers of raw materials. No longer open territory for corporations to claim. Researchers from South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, and Ethiopia all voiced the same idea. Africa is standing before a rare chance to reshape its position in the global value chain. And that opportunity begins with land. The biggest question, then, is not whether Burkina Faso can withstand the pressure. The real question is whether the world is ready to accept an Africa that refuses to play its old role, an Africa that demands control over its resources, an Africa that no longer waits for others to write the rules. Because if Africa's land truly belongs to its people, then its future belongs to them as well. And that question is forcing the world to reconsider itself, and to rethink assumptions that seemed unshakable for more than a century. There are moments in history that don't arrive with fireworks or speeches, but with a small change in the way people look at the world. Burkina Faso stepped into such a moment. When the government announced the land guardianship model, people didn't just see a policy. They saw themselves again, reflected in a mirror that history had long kept covered. And from that recognition, a new spirit began to rise. Quiet but powerful, like underground water after the rainy season. On the outskirts of Ouagadougou, a woman stood in her shea garden once threatened by the fence of a mining company. She looked at the old shea trees her grandmother had planted and said a sentence that left many people silent. "Now the land knows who I am." Those words were not just personal sentiment. They were the summary of a century of silent struggle, of generations forced to live on land whose fate they were never allowed to decide. In the northern grasslands, nomadic herders sat around a fire and spoke about the future in a completely different way. In the past, they had to avoid fenced-off zones, mining concessions, or fragmented territories claimed by foreign projects. Now, with the land map redrawn to protect traditional grazing grounds, they could finally talk about expanding their herds, digging new wells, or sending their children back to school. Stability was no longer a distant idea. It became a real possibility. But the deepest change came from the youth. A generation that once believed their future could only begin if they left their village. Their nation, their continent, now saw the land as a horizon opening instead of closing. A young man in Kaya said during a village meeting that he had never imagined staying before. Now he spoke about drip irrigation vegetable farms, about processing crops instead of selling them raw. And he said something with a new certainty: staying is also a choice now. The elders, keepers of the memory of a time when land was not carved up by foreign paperwork, looked at the change with something close to gratitude. They had watched traditional boundaries torn apart by maps no one in their village had ever been asked about. Now, they sat before their people again to speak about ownership, about the duty to protect the land, and about their hope that the next generation would not have to carry the fear they lived with all their lives. What makes this awakening remarkable is that it isn't a burst of excitement. It isn't a wave of emotion that will fade. It is a shift in consciousness. People suddenly understood that land is not only soil for planting. It is the root of dignity, the ground on which a nation builds its future, and the place where their voice finally gains weight in national decisions. When land belongs to the people, politics must belong to them as well. And when that happens, the entire psychological structure of society changes. This awakening spread like the late-season Sahel wind. No rallies, no propaganda, just one simple truth returned to the people: your land belongs to you. A statement that seems ordinary, yet carries the power to tear through the layers of silence that covered Burkina Faso for generations. And when people lift their heads and look forward, no longer bowed by fear of losing land or losing rights, a larger question quietly rises: if we can reclaim the land, can we reclaim everything else that was taken from us? When the Sahel dust settles over fields entering a new season, the people of Burkina Faso don't just see land being returned, they see themselves in it. Because land reform, no matter how it's described in legal or policy language, has never been just about paperwork. It is a story of coming home, coming back to roots, to the natural authority of a people, and to the truth that no development is sustainable if it is severed from the land where it was born. This is what confuses the world. Outsiders see the reform as an institutional shift, but the people of Burkina see it as the restoration of dignity. A farmer said that when he plants a seed, he's not only planting a crop, he's planting hope. And hope can only take root on land he knows will still belong to his children. That is the difference between a policy and an awakening. Across Africa's research centers, scholars have begun to explore the deeper meaning of land guardianship. They don't speak of it as a policy unique to Burkina Faso, but as the foundation of something larger, true sovereignty. They argue that a nation can lose everything and still rise, except its land. A people can be poor and still thrive, as long as they own their land. But if they lose their land, they lose their historical memory, their ability to decide their future, and their voice in international affairs. Many scholars point to a painful truth. For centuries, Africa was forced to accept the role of raw material supplier while the real value was created elsewhere. The gold, manganese, and copper mines of Burkina Faso have generated immense profits for foreign corporations, while the communities living beside those mines often lacked clean water. That injustice was never resolved because the center of power lay in who controlled the land. When Burkina Faso placed land under state guardianship, it was not only correcting internal injustice, it was questioning the structure of the global economy itself. And the reaction of the people made the reforms' meaning even clearer. They didn't celebrate with banners or festivals. They celebrated by planning for the long term, by digging new irrigation canals, by planting more trees, by thinking of the next generation. A woman in the south said she had never considered expanding her shea garden because the land could be taken back at any moment. Now she said she would plant 20 new trees. Those small acts, in reality, are the foundation of a national rebirth. Western analysts, meanwhile, debated risks. They feared economic influence slipping, feared the spread of the model, and feared most of all losing control over supply chains they had relied on for decades. But those debates only revealed one important truth. Burkina Faso had forced the world to admit that Africa has the right to self-determination. And that right begins with something very basic: land. Yet the greatest meaning of the reform is not found on the international stage or in the calculations of great powers. It lies in the quiet but profound change in the people's hearts. When they walk across their fields knowing the land belongs to them, they walk differently. Their backs are straighter, their eyes brighter. They no longer plant just to survive, but to build a future. And in that moment, Burkina Faso answered the question generations had carried in silence. Can this nation rise? And they answered with action. They rose from the land. If you believe this story deserves to be heard, leave a comment and subscribe. Your small action helps make Africa's voice stronger and clearer on the world's map.